Alright, what's up everyone? In today's episode we are going to see how we can use our arrow keys to select options, and I'm going to show you how to implement the options in case you forgot. So let's get right into it. And the first thing we're going to do is create a empty object and call it dialog options. Let me try to get this part as fast as possible. We'll create a text, call it question text. So this is just a little bit of a refresher. We'll create another empty object and call this buttons. And then we are going to create a button, and we are going to add a Unity event handler onto it, like so. And then we are going to create a couple more of these. Let's say like 4. Then we're going to add a grid layout group. And depending on what game style you want, you can have this to a fixed row amount so that there's only 2 rows at all times. You get as many buttons as you want. For this, I'm going to only have 4 buttons, and then I'm going to make it align in the middle center, and then move it down. And I'm going to adjust the cell size, make it a little bit longer, gonna make it a little skinnier, and then increase the spacing a little bit, like so. And then I'm going to change the text to white. Then I'll add an outline for a little bit more legibility. And again, I'm going to increase the height a little bit, increase the width, and then I'll have it align in the center by clicking here, like that. And then I'm going to increase the font size to something like this, and I'll test out how it looks. And you can't see the second line, so I'm going to increase the height a little bit until it pops up, and there you go. Alright, and so that should be good for the question. And that's about all we need. I'm going to disable the dialog options, go to my managers, and I'm going to drag in the question text into the question text area, and then I'm going to drag each button into the options button. I'll show you a quick little shortcut. If we hit the lock icon to the top right over here, it's going to lock the inspector panel, so no matter what I click on, this will stay the same. If I didn't have this selected, you'd see that it changes to whatever I'm selecting. So let's go back to our managers and lock it. I'm going to click on the first one and hit shift and click on the last one to select all of them. And I'm going to drag all of them into options buttons, and it will put them all in there. That's a really fast way to do that. And then I'm going to drag in my dialog options into my dialog options UI. So with all of that, this should work. But I am going to also, I went ahead and created a couple of dialogues, and this is the question dialog, and basically, let me do something real quick. And basically what's going to happen is the character is going to ask the player for their name, and you have 2 options. And so let's drag in question dialog here into our test NPC, and we just want to see if the question pops up, and it does. And if we click on here, my name is Link.
Alright, so now that we have the basic dialog option out of the way, we can now work on the next feature, which is using the arrow keys to select our options. Alright, so the first problem is that some of you may not know, but you can actually move around while you're talking to the NPC. This is something that's not very desirable because what's going to end up happening is we're going to want to select which option we want, but then it's going to move our character every time we want to select something. So how do we fix that problem first? So let's figure out how we can freeze our character. So we're gonna go to our player movement, and we are going to create a public boolean and call this check freeze, and we are going to make it a method. And so we're gonna want to return a boolean. First, we're going to create a generic boolean and call it b. And we are going to create some if statements and say if dialog manager dot instance dot in dialog. So if we're in the dialog, and just so you know that in dialog, if I do equals true, this is the exact same thing as if I didn't even have this here. So how would I want to make it as false? Is that I just put a exclamation point here, or I could say equals false. So those two are the same thing. So just know that dialog manager.instance.inDialog is the exact same thing as dialog manager.instance.inDialog is equals to true. Alright, so now that we know that, we'll say that if we are in the dialog, then b is equal to true. Else, b is equal to false, and then we can just return what b is. So if we're in the dialog, then b is true, and then if we're not in the dialog, then b is false. And this will come handy later, because then, let's say we have an inventory system, then we can check if we're in inventory. So it's going to check all of these things, and then depending on what it is, it'll return what b is. Alright, so now that we have that, we're going to check the freeze here. We'll just say if, and then we'll say check freeze, and then we just return. And so, what does this mean exactly? So it says if check freeze is true, so if we go through all these checks and b returns true, then we are going to freeze our character by just returning out of the update, which does not give us access to all the movement here. So all this code will not be able to be reached if check freeze is true. So let's see if that works. So I'm interacting with the character, and then you hear me hitting the arrow keys here, and I cannot move my character. So cool, we have that out of the way. So now how can we get these buttons with our arrow keys? Well, we actually already have that. So if we look here, Unity has it built in. You can't see it, but you can see it if you go to your button and hit visualize, and you'll see these arrows. And what these arrows mean is that if you hit up, down, left, or right, this is what it'll go to. And by default, automatic does a pretty good job, but if it doesn't get it correct, you can actually go to explicit and select which one it goes to, depending on which arrow key you hit. But because it did a good job here, I'll keep it on automatic. And let's turn it off. And so why doesn't it work then? So, because we have it, you can see that it works, and all things are hooked up. But it's because we're not selecting the button, the first button, whenever we open it up, so it doesn't have a reference to it. So let's create that reference. And it's pretty easy to do. We'll go over to our dialog manager, and we're going to go all the way down to the bottom to where we open the options. And we'll just create a little line of code. It's also just going to take one line of code. We're going to say options buttons, option button, and let's go back and see what option button is. So option button is our array of game objects, and it's the buttons that we dragged into the inspector at the beginning of the video. And so we have access to the game object, but we want access to the button. We want access to the very first button, actually. So we're going to create, or we're going to do brackets, and then put in a 0. Because it's an array, we can put the brackets here. and we can get the 0th element, which is the very first button. And then we can just say dot get component, and then we want the button component, and then we're just going to want to select that. And that's all we need to do. And so now, it's going to select the very first button, and we'll be able to navigate around. But let's make the highlighted color like a yellow orangey color so that we can actually see it. So let's go over to our character, and you see that it turns yellow. So there's a bug with Unity that it doesn't actually highlight the button whenever you select it through the code. Specifically through code, if you select it, it doesn't get highlighted, even though it is highlighted. So that's a bug that you probably have to find a workaround solution for. Personally, in my game, I did a hacky version to fix it, where I had an arrow to show which one, show which button's being selected instead of this highlighting feature. Alright, so we can now highlight the button, but we can't actually select the button with our keyboard. We have to use our mouse. So how do we change that? First of all, we're going to have to change the way our Unity event handler works. So let's open that up. And we're going to change a little bit of stuff here. Instead of using our mouse on pointer down, we're simply going to say public void initiate action. And we're going to take all this, copy it, paste here, and then we're going to get rid of that. And then we're going to get rid of this too. And as a general rule of thumb, you never want to have information in your script, in the inspector panel specifically, that is that you can change if you don't want it to be changed. So here in our Unity event handler, I never want to actually set a dialog here or set an event here. So we're going to hide that. We had it public initially because we needed to access it in different scripts. But we can just say hide in inspector for both of them. Hide in inspector. And so that way, public variables will be hidden in the inspector. To wait to compile. And there you go. So now we don't get to see it. And that's good because we don't want to change anything in there. So this still isn't accessible though, this initiate action. We didn't call it anywhere. Well, we already have this button set up, right? And so now we can just say add to list, and then drag the button in, and then go over to Unity Event Handler and initiate action. And let's do that for all of them. So I'm going to click there, drag them all in, initiate action, drag it in, initiate action, drag it in, and initiate action. So now if I click on the button, it's going to initiate the action. That's pretty much what we had before, but now we can hit enter and it'll initiate the action too, because by default Unity has it so that if you go over to our project settings, inputs, we scroll down to submit, and if you hit submit, it will actually press the button by default. And so all we have to do is change enter to a key that we want, let's say Z for our game, and it will act as our enter button. And so now let's see if that works. Go over to our character, and I'll hit Z, say my name is Link. There you go. But what happens if the character has no next dialogue? So I'll set this to none. I'll talk to it again. Select Link, and you see here that nothing should have happened, but instead what happens is that the character initiates another dialogue. This is because we're closing the dialogue and then we're initiating the next dialogue at the same time. And we don't want that to happen. So what we're going to do is that we're going to create a slight little delay when we initiate the action. And it's going to be very, very slight. Similar to what we did earlier in our dialogue system in the previous episode. But this one's going to be very, very slight. So we're going to create an IEnumerator and call this in dialog buffer. I'm going to yield return new wait for seconds. This will be 0.01f, which is 1/100th of a second. So it's going to be very, very, very slight. And then we're going to copy all this code, paste it here, delete this, and then start coroutine, and then put in the in dialog buffer. Okay, so let's see what that does. So you see here that when I hit link, or if I say that my name is Link, nothing should happen. And nothing happens now. Cool. Alright, so that's how you can use arrow keys and the Z button, or whatever button you want, to access your dialogue options. So there's one more thing that I want to go over, and that's how you can have multiple dialogues on one character. So let's go to our dialogue trigger, and this is all the code we have. And so we're gonna want multiple dialogues on one character. So the way we do that is by making dialogue base an array. What that will immediately do is create multiple dialogues that you can possibly have on one character. But you get an error, and it says that we cannot convert this dialogue base array to a dialogue base. So we need to access a specific index, or a specific element within that array, whenever we interact with the object. So let's create a private integer and call it index. And let's create a brackets, and let's access the index element. And so what this will do, by default right now, if I just play the game, index is going to be 0 by default, since I didn't set it to anything. It's going to work the same way we have it working right now. We're just going to access the first index, and that's kind of boring. We need to do a little more than that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it so that when we talk to this character, after we're done talking to this character, we're going to access the next dialogue. And so it's going to say something different. Let's set a public boolean and call this next dialogue on interact. And the reason why we have this here is because not all NPCs, you're gonna want it to say something different, right? So we'll have it specifically that if this boolean is clicked, then we will go to the next dialogue. And if it's not clicked, then just do the normal thing. Alright, so I'm gonna code a little bit, and then I'll explain why I'm doing this afterwards. So I'm gonna say if next dialogue on interact is true, then index is equal to -1. Else index will be equal to 0. Then I'm gonna say if next dialogue on interact and dialog manager dot instance dot in dialogues equal to false, or actually in this case, because I'm not doing equals true, I should do it this way too to stay consistent. we're putting the exclamation point to show that this is false. Then we'll say if index is less than db.length minus 1, then we shall increase the index by 1. Alright, so this looks a little confusing, but I'll explain. So, the reason why we're doing this way is because if we didn't have dialog manager.instance.inDialog is equal to false, what would happen is that every time we interact, in this case, we're pressing Z to interact, but Z also gets the next dialog, right? That's how you progress through the dialog. So every time you press Z, if we didn't have this, it would increase the index. We didn't want that. And so, but because we have this, if we had this part below the enqueue dialog, then like this, and we didn't have this, what would happen is that we would get into the dialog when we interact, and then this would never be accessible because we'd always be in dialog whenever we interacted, and so this would never get called. And so we have to put it above the point at which we enter the dialog, right? And so there's another problem with the index. So if next dialog on interact was true and index was 0, if we didn't put this to -1, what would happen is that it would always go to the first index whenever we interact, because this would be before the enqueue dialog. Now I'll show you what that looks like. I'm gonna do serialized field. What this does is it shows it in the inspector panel even if it's private. So I'm just doing this to show you the index. So once it compiles, you should be able to see the index here. There you go. And so I'm going to add 3 dialogues, and I'm going to have initial dialogue, and then a target dialogue, and then I'll have the question dialogue. And the target dialogue is just, this says, this is a super secret dialogue. That's it. So let's play. And so you see that because it says it is a next dialogue on interact is true, the index is -1. And so I'm going to go over to interact with this character. And before I press Z, because it's -1, there is no -1 element, right? So when I press Z, it goes to 0 and accesses the 0th element. And then I hit Z again, and it's not going to do anything with the index, because I have dialog manager.instance in dialog if it's false. Because I'm in dialog, it's not going to do anything. And then hit Z again, and it's going to go to 1. And we access the super secret dialog on the first element. And hit Z again, and it's going to go to the second element. And this is the question one, where I can select any. I can select it with my arrow keys too. And I'm going to select this one. And now, you might be thinking, well, if you hit Z again, it's going to go to the third one, but the third one doesn't exist. But it doesn't, because I have, this part. If the index is less than db.length minus 1, then this doesn't get called. And you might be wondering why the -1, right? Let's think about it. The db.length is the length of the array. Specifically, it's this number right here, the size. But notice how the size is 3, but the max, or the highest element, is 2. And so, what's going to happen is that if I didn't have this -1, then it would say, okay, the index is 2, and the db.length is 3. 2 is less than 3, so I can go and increase index by 1. The index would then be 3. And so if the index was 3, that wouldn't make any sense because there is no third element here. So that's why we subtract by 1 for this specific instance. You don't always subtract by 1, but for this dialog manager, you do. Oopsie, exit play mode. And so that should cover just about everything. I'll add in a little special. I'm gonna delete this. So that covers about everything, but I'll add in a little bonus to show you how you can change the dialogue through script that's not on the dialogue trigger. So let's say I didn't have next dialogue, and let's go and interact with our character. Hello, fellow NPC, I'm Link. Hi Link, I'm just an NPC. And that's the first initial dialogue. I'm gonna talk to him again, and she just keeps saying the same thing over and over again, because I don't have next dialogue on interact as true. So let's go over to our scripts. Let's exit out first. And go to our special event folder that I just created, but you don't have to create that. We'll create a C# script and call this dialogue target. And this is just a test script, so you don't have to call it dialogue target. I'm just going to show you how to do it, how to change the dialogue through a script. I'm going to derive from interactable. So basically, like, you don't have to actually follow along, you can just watch. So I'm going to create interactable. I'm going to say public override interactable. And I'm going to say I need to get the dialogue trigger from the NPC. So I'm going to create a public dialogue trigger. Call it DT. And then I'll say DT.index. Oh, right, I made it a private. So you don't want to make the index private, actually. You want to make it a public. And then we're going to hide it because we don't want to set it in our inspector. So make sure your index is public. And then I'll say dt.index equal to 1. And I'll go over and create a 2D object sprite. We'll give it a sprite. Let's give it this little heart here. And let's bring it up to another layer so we can see it. And then let us add the dialogue target script. And you can see the range. And then so it needs our dialogue trigger target. And it's going to be our test NPC. And so when we go over and press Z on this heart, it should allow us to access the first first target dialogue. And so let's go over and talk to this NPC, and we can see that the initial dialogue goes off, and she just says the same thing. Hello, fellow NPC. I'm Link. Hi, Link. I'm just an NPC. Well, I want her to say something different, so I'm gonna go over to this heart, press Z, go over back to her. Then now she says, "This is a super secret dialogue," and she's gonna keep saying that. And so that's how you can make NPCs say different things depending on different events. So let's say after you exited this area, you could have this trigger, like right here or something. And then when you come back to her, she says something different. Or let's say you have like a quest, and after you complete the quest, certain NPCs say different things. Or maybe during the night, the NPCs say different things. And so that's how you can make NPCs have multiple dialogues, as many as you want, and then have them say specific dialogues. So that's about wraps up this video, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Alright, I'd like to thank my Patreons, Bay, Emerson, Kirijo, Polybius, and Yoan. Thank you guys for supporting me. If you want to become a patron, you can go to patreon.com/devbird. You can also join my Discord, link in the description below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.